It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning, everyone. Coming up in our second hour this morning, it's Season 1, Episode 1 of Ask the Mayor for the Mamdani administration years. My questions and yours for the new mayor coming up for a half hour at 11 o'clock. Please do not call now. We'll just ask you to call back at that time if you do. But looking forward to kicking off our latest Ask the Mayor series. Also today, we'll spotlight the primaries today in New Jersey and California, with a lot at stake, both locally and nationally, through those. And now that it's June, some sunscreen recommendations from the New York Times Wirecutter, as it's time to keep yourself and loved ones safe from skin cancer. Don't sleep on your sunscreen. Let's start in Albany, though, where this is going to be a very consequential week, 3 days, actually. And it also sets up some of what we may need to ask the mayor about, because this year's New York State budget was only adopted last week, not around April 1st when it was due. The two moments when Albany actually gets things done, the budget at that time and the close of the session this week, have crashed into each other. Lawmakers are scrambling to finish by Thursday for the year. Why? With one eye on the June 23rd primary elections. That's why nobody wants to be stuck in Albany when they could be home campaigning. What that means in practice is that some genuinely consequential legislation hangs in the balance in the next 3 days. Everything from New York's response to Trump's redistricting wars, a crackdown on the algorithm that may be changing prices for products based on who you are, new rules for ticket resellers, and more. WNYC and Gothamist New York State Issues reporter Jimmy Vielkind is our man in Albany today, and he joins us now to talk about the mad dash. Hey, Jimmy, welcome back to the show.
Good morning, Brian. I just madly dashed into our booth here at the Capitol and ready to go.
Just in time. And listeners, with Albany about to make some decisions that could affect what you pay for groceries, who draws your congressional district, whether you can get a reasonably priced ticket to see your team or your favorite artist, we invite your phone calls, 212-433 WNYC. There's also a bill to regulate plastic packaging and packaging pollution generally, another one that would increase from 5 cents to 10 cents. The deposits on the bottles when you buy those at the store and cans. And so we invite your calls on any of those things, or if there's something else on this end of session agenda that I haven't even mentioned that you might be lobbying for, or that you're afraid they may slip in, that you're watching closely. 212-433 WNYC, 212-433-9692. Call or text. All right, Jimmy, let's go right to the redistricting amendment that was introduced late last night. It would let New York Democrats draw new congressional maps in time for the 2028 elections. What has to happen before then for New York to set this process off?
Well, it's a pretty cumbersome process, actually, to amend the New York State Constitution. First, you have to have one legislature pass a resolution, like a bill, and then there has to be an election, and the next successively elected crop of legislators has to pass exactly the same bill or resolution. And then the third step is that it goes on the ballot before voters who get to vote yay or nay. New York isn't an initiative and referendum state, so we don't have a lot of direct democracy here, but we do get to weigh in on potential changes to the state constitution. So there is really a long road ahead, but lawmakers have been watching what's going on around the country, and Democrats say they want to kick off this process now so that maybe some changes could be in place, as you said, Brian, for 2028.
As I understand it, the amendment would actually remove the state constitution's prohibition on drawing districts to favor incumbents or political parties. People with a long enough memory may recall that there was what was seen as a kind of nonpartisan, bipartisan, good government move some years ago to make it harder to draw partisan districts. There was this sort of good government, take partisanship out of redistricting as much as possible to avoid polarization movement around the country, and it got pretty far in New York State. It got into the law, into the Constitution, although then it crashed in practice, right?
Well, that's exactly right. And I do think that it's really important to understand the history here, as you said, of how we got here, and also to look at what exactly is on the table in this amendment that we expect lawmakers will propose or will take action on in the next few days. So it would have been one thing to just amend the state constitution, which currently prohibits mid-decade redistricting. In New York and elsewhere, people would do redistricting once every 10 years after the release of a new census. You have to rejigger your districts to make sure they're kind of balanced in population and to also account for the fact that
And that's, by the way, what's in the United States Constitution, right? There's a census once every 10 years, and then the states get to draw district lines based on that, right?
When I took this job, I was told I would only have to cover redistricting once a decade, and this has really upended that social contract. But in New York, there's an explicit state constitutional prohibition on doing it mid-decade, and this amendment, as you said, on the table would amend that. But it doesn't just do that. So for years and years, most of my lifetime, we had Republicans who controlled the New York State Senate, and we had Democrats who controlled the state assembly. And New York, which we all think of as a big blue state, actually had divided government up until 2018. And so that was the case during Andrew Cuomo's first term, which lasted from 2011 to 2015. And Cuomo worked with legislators to push forward this reform, and baked into it were all kinds of mechanisms that were designed and insisted upon by Republicans in the state Senate to give them some measure of power and to give them some measure of maintaining control over the redistricting process, because Republican leaders at the time knew it was absolutely existential for them that if districts were drawn, even in a kind of a nonpartisan way, but certainly in a way where Democrats were able to gerrymander, they would lose the state Senate. They would lose their perch in state government, their last remaining lever of control, and the party would probably descend into the wilderness. So flash forward. They got those redistricting restrictions. They were able to stay in power until 2018, but then Democrats won in an overwhelming wave, right? 2018 was the backlash election after President Trump's first election, a good year for Democrats. We saw Cynthia Nixon run for governor, and she brought with her a whole bunch of progressive lawmakers who won primaries against members of the Independent Democratic Conference. So basically, Democrats now control every level of power in Albany, and they have spent the last several years sort of walking back those changes. So the most significant thing, and I'm sorry to drone on here.
No, go ahead.
The most significant thing to my eye is not the changes to the process. There's an independent commission, and it goes back and forth, and it has to draw maps, and eventually if the maps are no good, then legislators get the pen. There are some changes to that process that make it easier for legislators themselves to draw the districts. But ultimately, what's most important are changes to the criteria by which districts can be drawn. And there was a specific paragraph inserted into the Constitution in 2014 by voters, which prohibited drawing districts to favor or disfavor an incumbent or to favor and disfavor a political party, basically saying you can't do partisan gerrymandering, that districts need to be compact, they need to be contiguous, they need to maintain communities of interest, they need to follow the Federal Voting Rights Act, and that was back when we had a much more robust Federal Voting Rights Act. It's been narrowed on the federal level, but that you can't do partisan gerrymandering. And that paragraph is explicitly repealed under the amendment now pending in Albany. And Republicans are going bonkers.
Yeah, because what's going on nationally is the Supreme Court recently, not the most recent voting rights decision, but Voting Rights Act decision, but a related decision on redistricting before that, they said, hey, partisan redistricting is okay. That's up to each state. So if Republican states are going, full bore into as partisan redistricting as they can muster, then Democrats in New York State are saying, hey, we better do this too, because a good government standard is nice on paper, but we're fools if we unilaterally disarm, right?
That is exactly the argument that Democrats are making. So Senate Majority Leader Andrea Stewart-Cousins, again, she was the victim of Republicans who gerrymandered to keep control over Democrats. She fought and argued for independent redistricting. But she issued a statement last night which said, quote, "New York cannot afford to stand still. We cannot ignore the reality that Republicans have repeatedly sought to undermine democracy through various attempts to gain political advantage. At a time when democracy is under attack across the country, we have a responsibility to protect all voters, including the minority communities, and ensure that every New Yorker continues to have a voice." So that's the Democratic argument, that they have to do this, or else if they disarm, then they'll be crushed.
Right. But I think in fairness, the Democrats in New York State were already engaging in partisan redistricting. You brought us a clip of Republican Congressman Mike Lawler, who's in a presumably competitive election in a purple district to keep his seat. And he made an interesting counter-argument this week. Here's 30 seconds of Congressman Mike Lawler.
The Democrats in New York have tried multiple times to change the maps, multiple times to get a partisan advantage in New York because they have absolute power and they think they can get away with it. I have spoken out against it. I have pushed back against it. I've introduced legislation, by the way, to ban it nationwide, to say mid-decade redistricting cannot occur nationwide, to ban partisan gerrymandering, to require independent redistricting commissions nationwide. So I've actually put my money where my mouth is on this.
Congressman Lawler, interesting clip, because he's right at least to this extent, isn't he, that a few years ago, the Independent Redistricting Commission that the voters established in that election in 2014, it had this provision by which if the commission, which is bipartisan, couldn't agree on districts, then the process would be thrown to the legislature. And the legislature at that time, 2024, I think, was overwhelmingly Democratic Party, and they drew a map that was partisan enough that the New York State Court of Appeals threw it out as too partisan. Do I have my recent history right?
That's absolutely correct, except it was 2022. It was the first year of the process. So in 2022, as Congressman Lawler said, the Democrats in control of this process for the first time since the civil rights era, they kind of went nuts like kids in a candy store. The map was called an egregious gerrymander. It would have taken the current New York State delegation, in which I believe we have 19 Democrats and 7 Republicans. The map that was proposed would have made it 22 Democrats and 4 Republicans, or maybe 23-3. So as you said, Brian, the State Court of Appeals heard challenges to this because inevitably all these redistrictings get litigated and end up in the courts. And it said that, no, this violates that partisan gerrymandering provision. And they had a judge in upstate New York draw the lines that we used in 2022. There was a little bit of a coda to that. Democrats said that the Independent Redistricting Commission should have a second crack at drawing maps. It was sort of a procedural kerfuffle. So the maps were, as Congressman Lawler said, amended again before the 2024 elections. But outside observers said that those amendments for 2024 were pretty minuscule. Democrats, though, did do really well in the 2024 elections compared to 2022. But my sense is that that is more of a reflection of the national mood, having President Trump on the ballot versus not, as opposed to the tinkering on the district lines.
All right. So, listeners, let's take one little step back. If you're just joining us, this redistricting package is one of the things that the New York State Legislature has to resolve one way or another by Thursday, when their legislative session ends for the year. We're going to take a very short break and come back and move on to some of the other legislative issues on the table in Albany that I mentioned in the introduction. The first one that we're going to talk about is a proposal to rein in this surveillance pricing or algorithmic pricing. Do you know about that? That's when an algorithm looks at your individual data and charges you more than it might charge someone else for the same item. You may not even know that that's happening to you. The state legislature in Albany is trying to address it. We'll talk about that and more when we continue with our state issues reporter, Jimmy Vielkind, right after this. Brian Lehrer on WNYC as we talk about some consequential bills that the New York State Legislature is trying to pass before the end of the session on Thursday. That's it for the year for the Albany legislators, and there are all kinds of things backed up. Okay, so we talked about the redistricting issue first. Now to the proposal with our Albany Issues reporter, Jimmy Vielkind, to rein in surveillance pricing, also known as algorithmic pricing. As I said before the break, that's when an algorithm looks at your data and charges you more, or I guess less, than it might charge someone else for the same item. Jimmy, how does it do that?
Well, in this world where we are buying things online, where we're sharing our personal data, where every time I go and buy a shirt, the store wants me to sign up for their rewards program so that it can create an account, it can track all my purchases. When you have all that data, it's pretty easy for a company to say, oh, man, Jimmy really loves those blue T-shirts, and we know he buys one every 6 weeks, so maybe we will charge him a little more in 6 weeks because we know he's going to buy it anyway. So in its kind of rawest form, there are digital price tags on the shelves that can sense who's nearby, see who's going, and literally set a variable price. So some Democratic officials, including Attorney General Letitia James, say this is pretty dystopian and want to ban it. Retailers, however, have said that, this is a really, there's this thing that's as old as time called a coupon or called a discount. And so if the company that sells me my blue T-shirts knows that I come in every 6 weeks to buy a new blue T-shirt, maybe they'll say after 5 weeks, hey, it's 5% off if you come in now. To try and incentivize me to make that purchase. So there's been a whole lot of back and forth on this bill. It has been amended numerous times, and we're going to see if there's a final version that comes together and what exactly it is going to do.
So one bill would ban that practice. Another, I see, would ban what they call electronic shelf tags in grocery stores and pharmacies. That would be specifically to prevent real-time price changes. Does that mean on the physical shelves in the stores, not for online purchases?
I believe so. There would be entities doing this, but it would include online retailers, where so it would include online retailers as well as store shelves.
All right. Another item in this mad dash, a bottle deposit bill. This would double the nickel deposit on bottles and cans and expand it to more drinks. And there's also a plastics bill, which we discussed on the show last week, did a separate segment on that. That would require a 30% reduction in single-use packaging over 12 years. Environmental advocates are pushing both after what they're calling the most anti-environmental budget in recent memory. That was because the rollback in the timeline for when carbon emissions have to be reduced in New York State and by how much. Can you tell us more about the bottle and can deposit bill? That's a 5-cent deposit now, with each bottle or can in certain categories that we buy now in New York State. What would change exactly?
So this would do two things. It would double that 5-cent deposit to 10 cents. And it would also broaden the category of beverage containers that are covered. NYPIRG, the New York Public Interest Research Group, has been campaigning for this for many years and been sending out what I consider to be very effective ads where they look at a Diet Coke and then a canned cocktail of Jack and Coke and say, why is it that the Diet Coke can you can get a deposit for, but the Jack and Coke canned cocktail you can't? It's sort of a head scratcher. It is a reflection of the fact that this system was set up before certain beverages gained in popularity or others sort of faded away. And they say that it's time to modernize this law and really make it easier for consumers. And by increasing that deposit, hopefully giving people more of an incentive not to toss those into a waste stream, but to get them into a recycling stream where they can reduce pollution and hopefully cause more material savings.
So the environmentalists want this for environmental purposes, to increase the amount of recycling. I've heard another rationale. We had a caller to the show recently who said, these people we see on the street who pay their bills to some degree by collecting bottles and cans that other people do throw away. And, you see them outside supermarkets putting one bottle or can after another in and, getting their nickel of credit per, that nickel hasn't gone up with inflation at all. So much inflation in the decade since the 5 cents was established. Now to help those people, it would be good to go to 10 cents, even though, of course, consumers would be paying that extra nickel every time they buy a bottle or a can that's in the category, and not getting it back if they don't return it. But have you heard that in Albany? Are the lawmakers talking about that? Help the recyclers, help the those who pick up the cans and bottles on the streets and cash them in?
That hasn't been a primary argument. It is certainly something that you're correct in describing, that it would be kind of an external effect. But as you said, Brian, the concern and the counter-argument from business groups is that this will raise costs. And if a six-pack of soda at the grocery store or a six-pack of beer at the bodega costs more than it did, theoretically people will buy less, and that's why you're seeing companies like Coca-Cola lobby heavily against this bill.
They think people will buy fewer bottles and cans of soft drinks.
Yes, if the price goes up as a result of the deposit, they worry that it will disincentivize consumption.
And the plastics bill, a 30% reduction in single-use packaging over 12 years, it would be required. Is it clear to you how it would be required and of what companies?
I think that the idea is to place the onus not just on the individual who buys a product and has all this plastic that it comes in, but on the people who are producing the product to get them to produce and package their things with less plastics. So advocates of this bill say it would essentially fall on producers to make this change. Business groups say that is going to reduce choice. It's going to increase costs. They say that sometimes plastic packaging is the cheapest and most efficient way of getting goods out. This has been a bill that has come up multiple times over multiple years. There's a woman, Judith Enck, who's a professor at Bennington College and the founder of a group called Beyond Plastics that has really taken up this mantle and has made a consistent campaign over many years.
And some listeners will remember she was on the show last week advocating for this.
So I won't rehash kind of the back and forth there other than to say that this is very much on the table. And as you said, Enck's argument is that with the changes that were made in the budget, which really upset a lot of environmental organizations, this is the time to perhaps give something on the environmental column. And we will see if lawmakers follow suit.
Can you tell if any of the bills that we've discussed so far, the redistricting, the bottle deposit, or the packaging reduction, are likely to go through by Thursday when the session ends for the year?
Well, to quote the great Yogi Berra, it's hard to make predictions, especially about the future. But I do expect that the redistricting amendment will be approved. We've heard from top Democratic leaders of the state legislature that they support this change. They think it's a positive one. We know that Democrats have the votes and control the state assembly and Senate. And I don't see any impediment to that going through as drafted and as released last night. I also think that given just the amount of political power that is behind this push for surveillance pricing, I do expect there will be some type of legislation that comes to consideration and is probably approved. It fits with Governor Hochul's campaign rhetoric and governmental rhetoric about wanting to make the state more affordable to residents. And I do believe that because of that, because the Attorney General is involved, some version of that will probably be considered if I had to predict. I'm not in a position where I'm going to make a prediction about the environmental or the plastics bills. They come up every year. There's a major, lots of moneyed interests behind stopping them. So I think that one is very much up in the air, and I'm not going to try.
All right. On that bottle deposit bill. Listener writes, a 10-cent deposit might not help homeless people, as much more people will return their own cans because of the higher price, therefore less for the homeless. So that's a theory, some market speculation on the 5 or 10-cent deposit. Listener also writes on redistricting, is it even possible for there to be fair redistricting? Imagine a hypothetical state that was uniformly distributed 60% in favor of one party. I guess that means 60% in each district, congressional district in the state. Any redistricting at all would result in 100% of the votes going to that party, which is pretty interesting. It actually makes me think of Connecticut. This may be beyond what you report on, Jimmy, but Connecticut, which I don't think is a state that's been cited as having particular redistricting battles, but I was looking up their stats, and about 40% of people from, according to the stats that I read, assuming they're accurate, about 40% of voters in Connecticut in 2024 voted Republican for Congress. Connecticut has 0 Republican members of Congress. And I think that is without hyperpartisan redistricting, probably more because of the distribution that this listener recommends. This listener, highlights as a hypothetical in places. Listeners, I don't know if I'm losing you in the weeds of this math, but I think to the listener's point, it does point to the difficulty in drawing some kind of objectively fair district lines that aren't really partisan, and even identifying what those would be.
Well, I want to say 2 things in response to that. One is that when I covered New York's redistricting in 2012, one of the people in charge of it was a guy named Jack McEnany. He is a Democrat from Albany, an old school Irish guy who came up through the Albany Democratic machine. And, it was basically his job to rebut all these calls for reform that year. And he said essentially that. He said, well, what are you going to do? How are we going to find a nonpartisan system? And then he'd have kind of a twinkle in his eye and he says, why don't we just let the Canadians do it? I'm sure they'll figure out something that's fair. But more in practice, what we have seen, particularly with regard to districts for Congress in the state of New York, is that the judiciary has basically taken over the process. In 2012, there was a deadlock. The Republicans gerrymandered the state Senate. The Democrats gerrymandered the state Assembly. They couldn't come to an agreement on what to do with the United States House of Representatives. And so a federal judge oversaw the process. And by most observers, myself included, those maps were pretty fair. They were pretty reasonable. And what makes them fair is not striving for a uniform partisan balance, but to recognize that different communities are interested. So I live in Albany. I can tell you what the lines are around the greater capital region, where people commute into cities, where you have a similar kind of quality of life, where you have unifying cultural forces, etc. And that should be communities of interest that represent a district. It's easy to do that. But when you take one place with one type of people that will have predilections toward one kind of political party, and you slice and dice it to offset or dilute other people who have perhaps different political predilections, that's where you can start to tilt things in favor, right? So one easy example in the city is Staten Island. The South Shore of Staten Island is pretty heavily Republican. So right now, Assemblymember Nicole Malliotakis represents a district that is Staten Island, as well as parts of southern Brooklyn, including Bay Ridge. If you were to draw that district and make it Staten Island and parts of Park Slope, it would be much more competitive. And in fact, Democrats have proposed doing that. Or if you were to take that district and unite it with Lower Manhattan, arguing that the Staten Island Ferry provides some kind of contiguity, you can make it much more competitive. But if you consider the patterns of settlement, if you consider many people moved from southern Brooklyn over the Verrazano Narrows Bridge onto Staten Island, it makes a lot of sense. And of course, the political and cultural alignment comes with that, and that often leads to political alignment as well.
Right. Listener writes, at-large proportional districts are how to handle that, which sets up a whole other conversation that maybe we should do a segment on sometime. Like, is there any realistic alternative, or even pie-in-the-sky alternative, to the way districts are drawn right now, we don't have at-large proportional districts. We'd have to even define what an at-large district is for Congress. But there are various proposals along those lines to, break us out of this hyperpartisan districting war era that we're in that are really structural. So maybe we'll get to some of those at a future date. For now, we're going to try to get through a few of these remaining legislative items that the New York State Legislature is trying to crash to passing or rejecting by Thursday when the legislative year ends. I mean, for the year. They don't come back until 2027 after this Thursday. And there are a whole bunch of consequential bills backed up that they're working their way through to pass or reject. We're taking down the list with Jimmy Vielkind, our Albany Issues reporter, on ticket resale. The law allowing resale on platforms like StubHub. That law is expiring. And here is Senator James Skoufis, who wants to ban selling above face value at all and cap fees.
The preposterous nature of how this system works, whereby at any given event, thousands and thousands and thousands of tickets are scalped, are set aside for VIPs, incorporate fees that in some cases double the actual price of the ticket itself. Fans are really angry. It's also worth noting that on the reselling piece, artists are really angry. And they're sick and tired of their concert halls being filled near exclusively with rich people.
So that's Senator Skoufis. On the other side of this, the resale platforms themselves say that would just drive everything to unregulated social media sites where fraud is rampant. And I guess that's not an insane argument, but is there a version of ticket reform that actually helps fans, or is the choice really just pick your form of getting ripped off?
Well, when you put it that way, Brian.
You're not going to have the ultimate answer to that, but that's the tension, right?
I actually think this is a really, really fascinating issue. I think it brings up really interesting behavioral economics questions, which I tend to love to think about. But looking at a realistic political context, if you were to do what Senator Skoufis is proposing and essentially ban resale for profit, that would be a major shift. That would be a major change. It would have implications that aren't really well understood on the ticketing markets. Some other states are considering caps. You could only resell your ticket on StubHub or SeatGeek, say, for a 10% or 20%. Pick your percent. Skoufis is saying 0, probably as a negotiating tactic to go up. But this is one of those issues where I think the hunger and the appetite for a substantive and big legislative bite is crashing against the reality of the state budget being 2 months late. Lawmakers spent an inordinate amount of time quibbling, bickering, and negotiating over Governor Hochul's agenda, which she baked into her budget and which she refused to let us pass a budgety budget, which dealt with dollars and cents, unless and until her proposed policy items were acted upon, and she has essentially been largely victorious in that. But because that took an extra 2 months beyond the April 1 deadline, the time that it would normally take for lawmakers to air these kinds of proposals, to gestate, to have lawyers on their staffs, to have people for and against weigh in, it's just so compressed. And so in that reality, in the fact that you have only 4 scheduled days this week, it's possible they'll work on Friday. I don't want to tell anyone to work a 5-day week, but maybe once. It's just a question of will there be enough time to make those big substantive changes, or will they do exactly what they did last year, which is to say, let's just leave it as is, extend it for another year, and maybe we'll get to it next year. So
let's end by talking about at least one bill that will not be considered because legislators say there's no time before the season ends, and that is e-bike regulation. We're getting some questions like this in texts for the mayor, for the Ask the Mayor segment coming up at 11 o'clock. So I have a feeling there will be at least one e-bike regulation at the city level that comes up later in the show. But obviously that's a huge issue that affects a huge number of New Yorkers, from delivery workers to commuters, and people have had near misses on the sidewalk or worse. So that's not going to happen. Anything else that's getting quietly buried or kicked to 2027 because the calendar is running out?
Well, you mentioned e-bikes. I wrote about last week the chairman of the Assembly's Transportation Committee, a guy from Syracuse named Bill Magnarelli, just said, look, we just don't have time. It was a victim of the budget. I suspect there are other issues like that that would have some kind of an impetus for a big legislative bite that just won't be considered this year. Thinking about it in my head, bills to change prison policy, to change the criminal justice system. There has been a push for something called the Second Look Act, which would let judges perhaps consider after a period of time whether someone's sentence should be reexamined, saying like if someone has been incarcerated for 10 years, they've turned their life around, they recognize they made a horrible mistake. Is there a benefit of keeping them behind bars for another 10 or another 15 years? Given the strain that we have in the prison system, this is something that is a policy that's gained some momentum. This year, the chief judge of the state's Court of Appeals actually endorsed the legislation. But I don't know that that's going to come up because, again, of this compressed time frame. And that also raises the specter of, was this all strategery by Governor Hochul? Did she purposefully drag out the budget? Because knowing that this is an election year, knowing that the clock is finite, that if she dominated the conversation with her agenda, it would lead to fewer things that would land on her desk that perhaps she didn't want to deal with going before voters. I've heard several lawmakers of both parties grumble to that effect. The governor says, no, absolutely not. This is not my intention. I'm still going to have a pile of bills to work through. But I do think there might be some credence to that argument.
WNYC and Gothamist New York State Issues reporter Jimmy Vielkind, thanks for keeping track of so much from the beginning of the year, all those moving parts in the budget that were fiscal items and policy items that got packed in there, and the conversations that we've had since January on those, and now for these end-of-session bills that will or will not get passed through Thursday, or as you say, if they for once in their lives work through Friday. You didn't quite put it that way, but we'll see how these things turn out. Thanks, Jimmy.
Thanks, Brian. Always a pleasure.